The conference room lights were unforgiving, flattening every face into something sharp. My dad spoke first, his voice steady enough to hurt. "You're suspended," he said, eyes lingering on me as if my presence alone could justify the decision. The room felt smaller under the harsh fluorescent glow, the polished table reflecting the tension like a silent witness to everything. My sister sat across from me, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though I noticed the subtle twitch in her fingers. Her smirk was perfectly controlled, the kind that promised she'd get exactly what she wanted without breaking a sweat. "I only mentioned it because, well, you weren't listening," she said, voice honeyed, almost innocent, but every syllable dripped with calculated offense. My dad didn't question her. He never did. His gaze shifted from her to me, not with concern, but with a silent approval that stung worse than any insult. Blind favoritism had always been his quiet rule. It wasn't love, it was power, and I was learning to recognize the difference. I leaned back slightly, letting the chair creak under me, the sound loud in the charged silence. I didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't even blink. Instead, I said a single deliberate word. "All right." It sounded almost trivial, spoken calmly, but in that room it felt volcanic. My sister's smirk faltered for the barest moment, though she recovered quickly, dismissing me with a flick of her eyes. My dad nodded, satisfied with the display, entirely unaware that my quiet acceptance was far from surrender. It was a pause, a measured breath before the storm. There was a peculiar weight to that word, a calm that carried its own threat. To anyone else, it might have seemed like resignation, a meek acceptance of authority. But those who knew me, or those who would come to know me, understood that all right wasn't the end. It was the start of something far more deliberate, a signal that the rules were about to change in ways no one in that room could predict. I could feel the shift, subtle but undeniable, as the room hummed with tension. My sister's fake offense, my father's blind favoritism, they were all pieces on a board I was just beginning to see clearly. And for the first time I realized that this moment, this unjust suspension, wasn't a punishment. It was the ignition. If my dad had known what that word would unleash, he might have stayed silent. But he didn't, and now the game had begun. I grew up in a house where silence was supposed to mean harmony. Took me years to understand it actually meant hierarchy. Every unspoken rule, every hushed exchange, was carefully calibrated to reward one child and diminish the other, though at the time I didn't recognize it. I remember a school project in 3rd grade, a simple diorama about the solar system. I had spent weeks crafting each planet with precise measurements and hand-painted detail. On presentation day, my sister's project, bright, loud, glitter-coated, and hastily stapled, received a standing ovation from our parents. I got a polite nod from my dad and a glance from my mom, who tried to hide the disappointment in her eyes. Even then, I understood that accomplishment meant less than spectacle, and I folded that lesson into my quiet patience. Years later, the pattern became cruelly clear. I had received my acceptance letter from my top-choice university, and I carried it with trembling hands, imagining my parents' pride. But the envelope was buried beneath napkins at my sister's engagement party. No words of congratulations, no hint that my achievement existed. Instead, all attention circled her. The ring, the dress, the perfectly orchestrated toast. I smiled politely as always because that was my role. The reasonable one. The one who observed without complaint, who endured without revolt. My mother, quietly, had been the only buffer. She noticed these imbalances, though she rarely interfered overtly. Her soft interventions, a whispered compliment, a gentle correction of my father's blind favoritism, were tiny acts of protection that kept the household from tipping entirely into injustice. She knew my worth when no one else did, and she reminded me in small ways that I mattered. But her passing changed everything. The balance she had maintained was gone, leaving a household sharply divided by favoritism and unchecked ambition. My father's partiality, once tempered by her presence, grew blunt and indiscriminate. My sister thrived in the spotlight, while I continued to play the background, my successes noted only in passing, my failures exaggerated to emphasize the contrast. The house lost her softness, and with it, the only person who kept my dad's blind spot from swallowing the rest of us. I learned early to measure my expectations and to remain calm when others celebrated themselves at my expense. I became the quiet observer, the one who calculated, waited, and endured. Being reasonable was both a shield and a strategy, a way to survive when the rules of the family were rigged. I realized that spectacle would always outweigh substance here, and that patience, careful, deliberate patience, was my only weapon. After my mom passed, the imbalance sharpened. The house lost her softness, and with it, the only person who kept my dad's blind spot from swallowing the rest of us and the family business. The pattern repeated itself with cleaner lines and higher stakes. What had started as childhood favoritism now took shape in corporate form, and I found myself trapped in a cycle I could neither escape nor ignore. My role was obvious: build, execute, fix. My sister's role was just as clear: promise, charm, distract. And my father, ever the judge, jury, and executioner of attention, blindly favored spectacle over substance. I built the development department from scratch. From empty desks and second-hand monitors, I assembled a team, trained them, and created processes that could withstand the chaos my sister effortlessly generated. Meanwhile, she spun impossible promises to clients. 4-week timelines for projects that required 12, budgets that ignored reality, features that didn't exist yet. Each time, my father would nod approvingly, as if her charm alone validated the feasibility. "She knows the clients," he'd say, and that was enough for him. Enough to ignore the work that needed to follow. Those promises landed squarely on my shoulders. I worked late nights under the blue glow of monitors, teams huddled together in silent exhaustion, rewriting code, troubleshooting servers, and patching together solutions that seemed impossible just hours earlier. Every deliverable was a reminder that my skill and patience were invisible, appreciated only when problems became crises. I learned the language of deadlines and the anatomy of stress without complaint, and my sister never noticed the strain she caused. She simply moved on to the next client, the next dazzling presentation, the next round of applause, while I meticulously documented every misstep, every skipped step in her promises. It became a habit, almost instinctive. That quiet documentation, stored in shared drives and notebooks, felt useless at first, but I sensed it might be my leverage someday. "Your sister handles relationships. You handle the rest," my father said one afternoon, dismissively, waving his hand at my growing to-do list. It was less an instruction than a decree, one that codified a hierarchy I could not change but had to endure. I didn't argue. I documented everything. It became my quiet language, written evidence no one wanted to read. If you've ever been the person who makes other people's promises come true, you know this exhaustion, the constant balancing of chaos and expectation, the silent tension of knowing the applause will go to someone else. But through it all, I began to see patterns forming, links between the favors, the blind spots, the misaligned priorities. I began to understand the architecture of inequality, now rendered in corporate spreadsheets and client presentations instead of school projects and family dinners. The more I built, the more I noticed the cracks forming in the foundation my sister relied on but never acknowledged. The business wasn't failing. It was surviving on borrowed trust, on my labor disguised as routine competence. And I was the only one who could see it, the only one who understood that the patterns repeating themselves here were not just business lessons. They were lessons in power, hierarchy, and patience. I didn't argue. I documented everything. It became my quiet language. Written evidence no one wanted to read. The last project before the suspension told me what I had refused to admit. The numbers were impossible. Deadlines crammed into a space that even the most efficient team couldn't hope to achieve. Budgets ignored reality entirely. And yet my sister presented it with that same confident charm my father nodded at without hesitation. "She knows the clients," he repeated, as if those 3 words absolved everyone else from thinking. I confronted him in the office, my voice careful, precise. He looked at me with that patient, dismissive expression, the one that said, "I hear you, but I will not change." I realized something simple and sharp in that hallway as I walked out afterward. I had spent a lifetime being reasonable for people who never intended to see me at all. Every compromise, every late night, every quiet correction, it had all been invisible. the suspension hit hard. It wasn't dramatic, not the way you imagine in movies. It was quiet, bureaucratic, almost polite. People avoided me as I passed, their eyes flicking away. Engineers sent worried messages, carefully worded, hinting at concern but not willing to intervene. My father called, not about feelings, not about fairness, but about optics. "We need to make sure this looks right," he said, as if perception mattered more than truth. Then came the memo. A crisp, printed page left on my desk with her name replacing mine in every title, every responsibility, every achievement I had built. My heart sank, but there was no room for anger, not yet. It was a quiet confirmation of what I had long suspected. The rules never applied equally. The hierarchy was real, and I had been the invisible labor beneath the glittering surface later. She appeared in the doorway, as if she owned the air. That smile, the same smirk that had followed me from childhood, didn't falter. "Just apologize," she said, voice smooth, confident, expecting me to bend again. The simplicity of her demand was infuriating. She expected capitulation, an acknowledgement that her version of reality was the only one that mattered. I paused. The room held its breath. And then I said the only word she never saw coming. "All right." It was the same word I had uttered years ago in the conference room, calm and deliberate. But this time it carried intention, clarity, and consequence. It was not surrender. It was strategy, a quiet signal that the pattern had ended, that the rules had shifted without anyone realizing it yet. The hallway, the memo, the worried messages, my father's cold optics, my sister's confident smile, they all converged in that moment. And for the first time I was fully visible, not because they had chosen to see me, but because I had chosen to act. The suspension, the dismissal, the favoritism, all of it became fuel. I had spent a lifetime being reasonable for people who never intended to see me at all. Now they would. I closed the door to my office and let the latch click into place. The sound was small, almost polite, but it marked a line I had never crossed before. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I moved with quiet precision, each step deliberate, each motion measured. This was not chaos. This was control. I began with the documents. Project scopes, risk assessments, meeting notes carefully stacked in neat piles. Each folder was a testament to late nights, impossible deadlines, and the work I had quietly carried while my sister promised the world. I wrapped my degrees and awards in tissue paper, pausing for a moment to let the weight of them sink in. They were tokens of achievement that had long been invisible, now handled with care and intention. Next came the resignation letter. Short, formal, professional. I didn't need to explain myself here. The facts would speak louder than any emotional appeal. "Please accept this letter as formal notice of my resignation," I typed, then saved it, leaving the cursor blinking with the inevitability of what was to follow. I compiled the evidence meticulously. Shared drive folders became my arsenal. Project histories, contracts, resource allocations, broken promises, impossible timelines, each annotated with timestamps and careful notes. It wasn't a case against anyone. It was a mirror. Every flaw, every lapse of judgment, every instance of my sister's incompetence was reflected back at them in black and white. My fingers hovered over the send button. Not out of doubt but precision. Timing mattered. The subject line read, "Project documentation and status overview." Within 60 seconds of hitting send, the phone rang. Lawyer. Board member. Clients, their voices careful, laced with disbelief. The room vibrated with consequences that had been quietly building for years. I left the prototype on the shelf, a silent witness to the impossible work that had become routine. It gleamed under the fluorescent light, a testament to what had been achieved without recognition. Then came the inevitable. My sister's return. She appeared in the doorway, breathless, her confidence replaced with panic. "What did you do?" she demanded, voice high, edges sharp with disbelief. I didn't answer. My desk was cleared, a perfect reflection of methodical detachment. Folders gone, awards gone, letters sent, systems documented. Every item I had handled now existed in evidence, distributed to the people who finally needed to see the truth. For a moment she was silent. The smirk, the charm, the unshakable assurance. All evaporated under the weight of what I had just set in motion. I gathered my coat, slid my bag over my shoulder, and without a word, walked past her. No apology. No hesitation. No permission sought. The click of the office door behind me echoed like a final punctuation. I had crossed a line I would never recross, and the pattern that had defined years of my life was broken. Every step away from that office felt like shedding a lifetime of expectation. The quiet control, the careful planning, the evidence meticulously documented. All of it culminated in this single, decisive exit. And as I passed my sister, still frozen in shock, I realized that being reasonable had finally served its purpose. Not submission, but liberation. I walked past her without waiting for permission. I arrived at the office just before 9. The lobby was louder than usual. Whispers tucked behind coffee lids, glances that skittered away when I looked up. Something had shifted overnight, though nothing had officially happened yet. The air carried tension, brittle and expectant. I walked past it all with measured steps, calm and deliberate, as if nothing could touch me. The conference room was already occupied. My father seated at the head, his posture strained. My sister perched near the edge, her confidence tight and brittle. The lawyer and a paralegal arranged papers with careful hands. Everyone turned toward me as I entered, the silence settling like a weight. "We can work this out," my father said, voice low, almost pleading. He tried to negotiate even as he surveyed the empty office left behind, as if the previous week's events hadn't already spoken louder than words. I placed my portfolio on the table with a soft thud. Inside, the resignation letter, clean, formal, and complete. I slid it across, the edge brushing his fingers without a word. The severance terms, contract clauses, and notice periods were all documented, legally airtight. Then came the second folder, the complete documentation of every broken promise, every impossible timeline, every lapse in project management, annotated and organized. The weight of it filled the room more than any raised voice could. "You can't send this to clients," my sister blurted, her voice cracking despite her effort to remain poised. I didn't flinch. Calmly I revealed, "I already sent it." The room dropped into a hollow silence. No whispers, no distractions, just the slow sinking realization that the person who had held everything together, the backbone of every functioning department, every crisis averted, was no longer beholden to anyone. The lawyer closed the folder with trembling fingers. "Anyone who values competence," they said, voice heavy with unspoken approval, "would understand this action." My father's face, once unreadable, began to falter. In trying to defend my sister, he inadvertently admitted, "Well, she didn't fully understand the requirements." His words hung in the air, a confession thinly disguised as a defense. My sister's eyes widened, realizing her father, her protector, was subtly turning against her. "We need you for the Hamilton account." He tried again, desperation creeping into the tone, an appeal to necessity rather than merit. I shook my head, my voice even. "I already left." Her panic became palpable. The folders, the timelines, the projects she had never understood, and the reliance everyone had quietly placed on me. All of it now pointed back at her. My calm had shattered the illusion, and for the first time, she faced the consequences of the invisible labor she had ignored. The lawyer nodded, confirming the legality and correctness of my actions. The paralegal adjusted their papers nervously. Even my father, caught between paternal instinct and harsh reality, could only offer a dying smile. Half pride, half regret. As the truth settled in, I stood, collected my bag, and walked out of the conference room. Past my sister's stunned silence. Past the lawyer's pale shock. Past my father's strained, dying smile. I didn't look back. And just like that, the entire system I had once tried to hold together began to collapse without me lifting a finger. The hierarchy, the favoritism, the impossible cycles of promises and labor, all unraveled in the quiet absence of the person who had kept it functioning. I had walked out, but the consequences would echo long after my footsteps faded down the hall. I left the building without checking if anyone watched. The air outside felt different, lighter somehow, as if the weight I'd carried for years had finally realized it no longer had a host. The sunlight didn't just hit my face. It seemed to follow me, brushing away years of silent labor, invisible effort, and quiet endurance. That evening at home, I sank into the couch with Cooper, my dog circling happily around my legs. I didn't check emails, I didn't replay conversations. I didn't measure what had been lost or won. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel like erasure. Felt like freedom. I brewed coffee without urgency, listened to the hum of the city outside, and allowed myself to just breathe. Morning came with clarity. At the new company, I walked into a bright, open office where competence mattered more than connections or family politics. The team greeted me with smiles and professional respect. Meetings flowed efficiently, deadlines were realistic, and the air carried a curious mix of challenge and ease I hadn't known existed. Standing by the windows, I reflected on the acceptance letter I had once buried under engagement napkins, the late nights building a business on invisible labor, and the years of being reasonable for people who never intended to see me. Leaving wasn't a loss. It was an opening, one I had created with nothing more than facts, restraint, and a willingness to stop rescuing people who confused my competence for obligation. Silence, I realized, was a doorway, not surrender. Permission was never required to claim your worth. If you've ever stood in a room where your worth was treated like background noise, let this story remind you. Your life doesn't need their permission to change. Thank you for listening. If you want more stories like this, stay close. There's more to tell.